systematic omission and Holocaust memory since the 7th of October. My name's Mark Russling. I'll be chairing the session today. I'm Director of Learning at the National Holocaust Museum. We're going to stick to the same procedure as before. We'll have 4 presentations. I think we'll just roll through them and roll the questions together at the end. So we're going to slightly change the order that you've got in the programme, and we're going to start with Jamie Ashworth, who is a researcher and Holocaust educator.
Thank you very much.
Over to you, Jamie.
So many statistics. Can you show me a statistic that says any of it makes any difference? So I responded by pointing out the UCL research in 2015, which clearly highlights that survivors make a huge difference in Holocaust education. But his concern, it turned out, was bigger. Why is there so much hate, he asked, not just against Jews, but generally? After some discussion, reiterating the vital importance of his work in giving testimony, we agreed does not plant acorns in the expectation that one sits under the tree. One plants seeds for their own sake. This paper is a little bit of a Jeremiad, though I don't think the attitudes it critiques, that combating anti-Semitism should be the core lesson of the Holocaust and the only worth education are imaginary. I think they are both increasingly present in everyday discourse, with elements both stated publicly and researched. So in January, Karen Pollock of HET argued in the Jewish Chronicle that HMD is a day to mourn the 6 million lives lost because they were Jewish and to vow with unshakable resolve to reject the anti-Semitism that has taken root historically and once again is a blight on the world. Also declaring that any attempts to downplay, distort or corrupt the truth of the past must not be allowed. Taken with the headline, it suggested a jettisoning of the memorialization of other genocides and a focus on anti-Semitism as the cause of the Holocaust. Before going any further, I need to say what this paper is not. It's not an attempt to critique the role of Holocaust memory in coming to terms with 7th of October. As Alan Mintz has written, catastrophe convulses and vitiates shared assumptions. But it must also use what has come before to make sense of it. Of course, as Jews, we look to the Shoah to a sense of confusion at a shift in position of the Holocaust in Jewish memory has been part of the aftermath, as this poem by Abraham Sharon says so elegantly. Whether the fear, grief, and continued stress of the past 18 months constitute a reason to narrow Holocaust education to combating anti-Semitism is, I think, another matter. 7th of October is not the only reason for this shift. There have been and are terror attacks and violence in the UK. Controversies attending Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of Labour raised the collective temperature, creating a growing sense that, as David Baddiel put it, identity politics has failed one particular identity, that Jews don't count. The emergence during the COVID pandemic of new anti-Semitic tropes and grotesqueries also intensified feelings of fear and vulnerability. And this at a time when nobody needed additional worries. Jews have come honestly by our sense of alarm and anger and fear. Whether that justifies orienting study of and education about the Holocaust solely to the combating of anti-Semitism is another question, and I think there are reasons to be very cautious. So Christopher Browning began his study of the German Foreign Office by pointing out that in the Third Reich, anyone in a position of authority had to start from the premise which problem existed as Hitler envisaged it. It was the explanation of everything else. Hitler's anti-Semitism created an ideological imperative. The ultimate problem required an escalating search for an ultimate or a final solution. But it's significant that this is a premise, not a conclusion. The history of the Holocaust is not simply its reasons, but its outcome. The detail of the search on the ground by bureaucrats for a final solution. The meaning on the ground for perpetrators, for bystanders, and above all, for victims. To see anti-Semitism as the defining feature of perpetration is a problem, since scholarship suggests that it anti-Semitism was one of many competing, interacting, dispositional and situational factors in the carrying out of the killings. For some perpetrators, it was a major factor. For others, much less so. Historians who have placed anti-Semitism at the centre of their explanations have tended to illustrate Richard Levy's contention that it's not a fruitful approach. The most skillful and successful historian to put anti-Semitism at the centre of analysis, Saul Friedlander, noted carefully that the Jewish issue was one of the central tenets of the regime's worldview and thus of its policies. Other historians, however, have, for example, written top-down narrative of the beliefs of senior leaders, relatively divorced from actual killing, made tendentious claims about the collective beliefs of millions of ordinary Germans, or made arguments so focused on Germany that the reader might be confused to learn that the bulk of the victims originated from and were killed elsewhere. For while, of course, it originated there, most of the Holocaust did not happen in Germany. Given these problems in producing research based solely on anti-Semitism, we should anticipate similar problems in delivering education on that basis. The Holocaust was not monocausal, and we cannot pretend it was. For the victims, moreover, placing anti-Semitism at the centre of Holocaust education risks relegating all the other aspects of their lives to background, to the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. Even if little can be known of Cyril and Zelig Jacob's life beyond this image, I refuse to engage in the historical condescension of reducing them to the stars on their chest, or to the fate which awaited them just after this image was taken. They were more than that. It was not destiny, but a complex series of events and decisions that brought them to the ramp in Birkenau. And finally, there is a definition problem. I'm not as critical of the IRA definition as some are, but as a tool for challenging contemporary anti-Semitism, it needs to be recognised that its examples are overwhelmingly concerned with Holocaust denial and with finding the difficult line between anti-Semitism and legitimate criticism of particular Israeli governments. It is a working definition for today, and what it illustrates best is that anti-Semitism is changeable and persistent. As Levy writes, the Holocaust is over, anti-Semitism is not. 17 years ago, David Engel warned against the reification of anti-Semitism. He noticed that instead of describing anti-Semitic acts as the product of anti-Semites, these actions were depicted as produced by an abstract, disembodied anti-Semitism, a quality that had existed long before it had been given its current name, and which acquired almost devilish, anthropomorphic qualities. This eternal view persists, occasionally resulting in the use of biologic metaphors which, though doubtless influenced by COVID, also inadvertently recall some of the most vicious Nazi imagery used to attack Jews. This is perhaps what Michael Rothberg terms a boomerang effect, where an attempt to quantify what Langmuir termed chimerical hostility has embraced the logic of the persecutor, magnifying their fantasies with a reciprocal terror of their consequences. In other words, in our concern to combat anti-Semitism, we risk forgetting that it's anti-Semites who are the source of the words and the actions that threaten us. The historical consequences of that approach can be seen in Daniel Goldhagen's Hitler's Willing Executioners, a fundamental weakness of which is the failure to differentiate between those for whom anti-Semitism was an obsession and those who held anti-Semitic beliefs more or less strongly, more or less consciously. Daniel Staitsky has termed this distinction the elastic definition of anti-Semitism. In a recent commentary on his 2009 article, Engel described how he reached an impasse in interpreting the actions of Polish historian and politician Stanisław Kot, since neither he nor his colleagues knew of any evidence testifying to what Kot felt about Jews in his heart of hearts. Engel's solution since has been to reject the word anti-Semitism entirely in his own voice, instead using precise description allowing documents, incidents, and actions to speak for themselves without adjectives. In the classroom, our job as educators is to show students what happened, and then be ready to practically and emotionally hold the broader discussions about what that means. Michael Maris and many others have challenged the idea and substance of moral lessons. Maris suggested instead that good scholarship and good teaching underpin our approach. For myself, I like the approach of Javi Dreyfus. I personally will continue to use the concept of anti-Semitism, not only anti-Semitism, not always anti-Semitism, and certainly not anti-Semitism as a sole explanation. We need to talk about anti-Semitism, but as a social product rather than an amorphous spectre or existential essence. We should not dignify the anti-Semites with the sense that they are drawing on some ancient force, but make clear that they are willfully misunderstanding and misrepresenting the world through fear, through ignorance, and through malice. It's possible that historians among us roll their eyes at this reason. They might say that we've known since the 1980s that we need to go beyond structure, beyond intentionalism and functionalism, and that a lot of ink has flowed through the presses since. I disagree. Firstly, I think these are fundamentals. Is history driven by ideas or material conditions? By great men or the great many? By ideology or circumstance? By intention or structure? We may feel that we know the answers to these questions, but we must remember that our students come to us in order to learn. We can't skip over these issues. We have to help them come to their own conclusions. Secondly, there's a reason this debate persists. It's important. As Ian Kershaw writes, interpretation must take into account Hitler's ideological goals, his actions, and his personal input. But it must also locate these within social forces and political structures. We also need to remember that historians are part of their societies. As Neil Gregor put it, historians are socialized in cultures saturated with myth too, and these cannot fail to influence the assumptions from which they themselves formulate the questions they ask of the past. To understand the historians of this field, it's necessary to understand the literature and the shifting understandings, the history of the historians, if you will. Students need to understand why we've moved beyond this debate, because neither model fully explains the past, because they negate each other, and because both contain important elements of truth. They need to understand why it was so important for bureaucrats and field officers to work toward the Führer, and why this dynamic has emerged as critical. It is perhaps more chilling to consider that men like Alfred Filbert made decisions to kill thousands of Lithuanian Jews for a range of motives, including potential career advancement, but with little evidence of deep-seated anti-Semitism. But to do this, students need to understand the ideas and the structures which led there. So, some suggestions. History is about what happened. It's the construction of an account of the past derived from inspection and analysis of its traces. Because we can only work with what there is to find, it's easy to fall into the trap of assuming that events happened as they did because they had to. But applying that to anti-Semitism and the Holocaust raises some really hard questions. If the Holocaust happened because it had to happen, was this just individuals caught up in impersonal forces they couldn't control? If anti-Semitism is a virus, do we blame the sufferers for catching it? For something to be morally wrong, there must be a choice. We must instead ask, did it have to be this way? Did these people have to believe these things? Did they have to act accordingly? Alternatively, if we see people as responding to contingency, simply solving problems as they arose, we fall into the opposite trap. We forget that perpetrators possessed agency and choice, and nor were they straightforwardly acting under duress, which is one of the most persistent, basic misconceptions about the Holocaust. We must ask why individuals chose what they did to resolve their dilemmas. Path dependency, where crucial actor choices may establish certain directions of change and foreclose others in a way that shapes long-term trajectories, offers a way to talk about the past that allows us to think about it more flexibly. In one sense, you can dismiss path dependency as the idea that history matters. But it also raises questions about how, before critical junctures were reached, other options and outcomes were possible. Why and how, for example, did the NSDAP, a relative outlier in 1924, come to take power so comprehensively in 1933? Did it have to be this way? Path dependency sees the past as the result of encounters with consequences and relationships that are both linear and the product of contingency. To use a personal example, a photo of my wife's grandmother in Aachen in 1939 has a linear relationship to the picture of my daughter in London in 2025. But we can also recognize that that relationship is the product of chance and contingency. Claudia Bruns has described how images of Gog and Magog in Mappimundi were used as illustrations of monstra, describing the discursive entanglements between different racisms through which figures conceived of as physically different and or sexually and religiously deviant were mapped onto each other, with, for example, Jews made black by association with the biblical Ham, whose blackness of soul was later used to explain blackness of skin. Bruns calls this complex transnational work genealogical, and I think this is really useful. Antisemitism and colonial racism are cousins, sharing a common heritage and traits, but not identical, and the Holocaust has both in its intellectual heritage. In a recent article on race in the global history of Europe, Priya Satia reviews the vast and complex literature attempting to explain how racial thinking enabled the development abroad of destructive visions and practices that were applied in Europe from the 1930s through the Second World War. She draws attention to the degree to which anxieties about race and sexuality coalesced in the targets of Nazi violence: Jews, homosexuals, non-white Europeans such as the Roma. Satia also highlights the fears of racial degeneracy and degeneration identified by David Cesarani in Anti-Alien Attitudes in Britain, directed after 1919 with particular viciousness against Jews, Chinese, and blacks. We only need to look briefly at the treatment of Black Germany and other social outsiders to see the overlapping of attitudes, of policies, of legislation, of personnel, and locations. As Tony Kushner argues, it's by connecting different racialized histories that we properly understand any of them. We must reject the unconscious assumption that comparison means diminution. Alex Kay's Empire of Destruction examines Nazi violence through the prism of mass killing. Kay argues that 7 such campaigns claimed almost 13 million lives. For me, this table is a way to talk about different victim groups targeted by the Nazis, while also clearly showing that the Nazis prioritized the killing of Jews above all others. The key fact that Jews were most affected by Nazi violence is inherently comparative. Most compared to what or to whom? Comparison also allows us to see the fates of different groups within linked and mutually reinforcing processes. Birkenau, an extermination site for Jews and for Roma, built on the site of a demolished Polish village by an army of Soviet POWs, most of whom died in the process. Every story is essential. Alan Mintz warns us against the idea that catastrophe has a discoverable essence. meaning we can't come to the Holocaust and insist that only our understanding of its meaning is valid. For Jews, of course, the Holocaust is different. It does have a discoverable essence. It's not like other historical events. As Posner in Alan Bennett's The History Boys says, yes, but the difference is I didn't lose any relatives in the dissolution of the monasteries. I love Michael Burley's comment that Nazism is not a matter of academic contemplation for many people, but rather something which explains why they have no relatives or children, why they're chronically ill or have severe psychological problems, or why they live in Britain, Canada, Israel, or the USA rather than Central Europe. But this is exactly why we have to understand how those places have constructed the Holocaust through the cultural encounters and clashes which are the stuff of multi-directional memory. The 1967 film The Pawnbroker, for example, sets Holocaust trauma in New York alongside other traumas of displacement and colonial racisms. If we must always question, as Posner in The History Boys also says, whether attempts to explain the Holocaust are attempts to explain it away, we also have to remain open to the contexts or juxtapositions that illuminate and resonate. Conclusion. David Mottadell has recently written of a proposed global turn as an opportunity to critically reflect on fundamental paradigm. Returning to the metaphor of a tree, of planting seeds for the future, we must ask ourselves, I think, what kind of tree we wish to grow. We owe the future and the past a tree with a strong trunk, rooted firmly in historical fact, sending forth branches to encompass a multi-directional future. Thank you.
Very quickly onto James Karani. So James is an associate professor of modern European cultural history at Durham University.
Okay, so thank you very much for that, and thanks to the organisers as well for making this event possible. I should say, just a quick word of warning, I usually work on alpine tourism in the 19th century in the Habsburg Empire, and on Hungarian botanists and Transylvanian Saxon explorers and so on. But I have also worked and continue to work on German minorities in East Central Europe, and it's out of that area of research that I want to just introduce a few thoughts, really. This is an exploratory paper, and I'd be interested to hear what you think and how it fits in with the discussion here more generally about emissions since the 7th of October. It actually predates it a bit, and also how it relates to anti-Semitism. So both those issues are going to occur in this paper. Now, it starts with the opening of this new museum in Berlin, in the Deutschlandhaus, close to the Anhalter Bahnhof. It's the documentation of flight, expulsion, and reconciliation. Opened in June 2021 after decades of political wrangling, and with this threat in mind. We have about a minute left, Ricky, until it turns off, I think, up here. We'll see. Let's hope it doesn't turn off. It opened in June 2021, and maybe to my surprise, it left almost no mark. And my central question is why, after decades of political wrangling over the position of the memory of the expulsion of 12 to 15 million Germans from East Central Europe, why was there no resonance whatsoever? So why is expulsion no longer seen as a threat to the Holocaust, or vice versa? Yeah, in Germany. This is all set in Germany, but it relates to broader European trends. And why have recent trends and movements in post-colonial memory and activism not discovered the obvious ample repository of expellee memory and refugee memory to make common cause? So both those questions sort of hang above this. I'll suggest a few tentative conclusions at the end. There's a sort of circumstantial stuff about the COVID pandemic, about generational change, but also, and I can foreground this early on, anti-Semitism as a driving force of seeing new contestation with Holocaust memory rather than looking for common ground as such. So, without wanting to be patronizing too much, but this is just really a very, very quick this is me enforcing my own sort of pattern on public memory in Germany since 1945. What I want to express here is that for a long time, Holocaust memory, so perpetrated discourse, and the memory of German victims, that is the victim discourse, they stood in opposition to each other for a long, long time. So when victim discourse was high, the kind of focus on perpetrators or indeed on the Holocaust was low, and vice versa, and they often sort of locked in very sort of in a sort of conflictual way against each other. But then you have this new German victimhood around the new millennium, and you have the rise of post-colonial memory, which makes the whole thing complex. And it's really that last bit that I'm quite interested in, and might explain why the opening of the museum in central Berlin didn't really do much in terms of political discourse, thinking about where German memory lies and so on. Now, to understand that, I think I just have to briefly remind everyone, again at the risk of doing something that you probably know quite well, is just to go back to this central problem of expulsion versus Holocaust, which really dominated the German public sphere for a long time. Most notably, of course, in the 80s, when it came to this so-called Historikerstreit, the historians' dispute, which, you know, people sort of situate from June 86 to 89, when Germans, when their attention turned to other issues such as reunification. But actually, it's a much longer story. There are a number of events leading up to June 86, when Ernst Nolte famously writes this article in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung saying "the past that will not pass," referring to the sense of guilt in German history. There are a number of books, such as Andreas Hillgruber's book Zweierlei Untergang, Two Kinds of Ruin, where he equates the Holocaust with the expulsion of 12 to 15 million Germans, and also an article by Michael Stürmer in the FAZ, in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, where he talks of history being controlled by those who determine the content of memory. And I want you to hold that quote in your minds as we turn to events in 2021 and then also after the 7th of October. So controlled by those who determine the content of memory. Against that, you had people like Jürgen Habermas, Jürgen Kocher, Eberhard Jäckel, Hans Mommsen and others who very much defended the sort of uniqueness, what they saw as the uniqueness of the Holocaust. And it was not neatly so, but roughly right versus left, right? So the right trying to sort of challenge the position of the Holocaust in German memory, and the left sort of defending it. And it's quite interesting to note that kind of the positionality of that, because it looks very different in the late 2010s, early 2020s. So the past did and did not go away, is my contention when we come to 2021. How so? Well, it went away in the sense that no one was really interested in expulsions anymore, we figure out. German expulsions, the real driver of political discourse and memory in Germany, simply just didn't register anymore. So in some ways, Nolte kind of got his wish fulfilled, but the wrong way round. German expulsions disappeared altogether. Not altogether, I'm exaggerating, but it just didn't play that big a role. It didn't go away, though, in the sense that the position of the Holocaust was very much contested, continued to be contested or recontested, relitigated in 2021. And there were a number of events that led up to it. Achille Mbembe on the right and his disinvitation by the Antisemitism. What is his official title, Bill? Felix Klein, Antisemitism Czar, yeah. His disinvitation from the Ruhr Triennale in 2020, ongoing sort of exhibitions at the Documenta in Kassel from 2020 to, or even preceding that through to 2022. But then famously, the so-called Historikerstreit, Historians' Dispute 2.0, so the second rendition of this. You've heard, I think, references to this both in yesterday's keynotes, but also elsewhere. Where the website Geschichte der Gegenwart hosted a series of articles, contradictory articles. Bill was involved in one of them, as well as others. Helmut Walter-Smith, Joachim Heberlein and others. But Dirk Moses, it was triggered by Dirk Moses' contention that German politics and memory are very much still sort of adhere to what he calls central catechism or catechisms in German memory. There are 5 of them. One of them relates very specifically to Israel and Germany's sort of what Angela Merkel calls of Germany's special loyalty or what they sort of debt to Israel. And he talks of high priests, of catechism. It's a very loaded way of writing about, I guess, Holocaust memory, and received quite a bit of pushback, but also support on the other side by people such as Miriam Brusius and others. So all of this is happening in 2021. I just want you to think about that. This is May, June 2021. The Paul Museum opens on the 21st of June 2021. It has no chance in the kind of febrile atmosphere of Germany to make any kind of political waves whatsoever. I was really interested in the museum. No one was interested. No one wrote about it. It opened without much fanfare and without much pushback or support. And so this is really the context in which we can think about the position of expulsions in public memory. Now, expulsions for a long time continued to rumble on as this hot potato that often brought into sharp relief not just negotiations within the German public sphere, but also external relations with Poland, with Czech Republic, and so on. Erika Steinbach, for a long time, the founder of the Center Against Expulsions from 2000 to 2008, the president of the Federation of Expellees until 2014, still represented an older way of thinking about expulsions, namely a memory that could only really be fulfilled if that relationship with the Holocaust was cleared, in a sense, and cleared in favor of making space for the memory of expulsion. So she still represented this older sense coming from a sort of conservative right-wing milieu from the 80s of seeing the Holocaust as a threat to space for the memory of expulsions. She steps down as the president of the Center Against Expulsions in 2008, and then that whole idea of remembering German expellees takes on a very different note. It's renamed as Sichtbares Zeichen, a visible sign. And then from 2016, it's the historian Gundula Bavendam who takes on the directorship of this future museum, which I've been talking about, and she still is the director nowadays. And I will now take you through the museum virtually, as it were, to explain how they've tackled the relationship both to the Holocaust but also to the broader sense of expulsion. The Deutschlandhaus is a historical house. It was built or completed in 1931. And originally, it was there for sort of light entertainment and shows and so on. It was then used by the Nazis for the Ministry of Labor, I believe. And then after the war, it became a hub for refugees from the GDR, but also for expellees and refugees from East Central German refugees from East Central Europe. So you walk in, and it goes to great. I'm sorry you can't read the writing, but it goes to great lengths of talking about the spirit of reconciliation in the bottom there. It also clearly steps into a tradition of remembering German expellees. It has this wonderful stained glass artwork. Which was produced in 1950 by someone called August Wagner, remembering the expellees from Silesia. And then throughout the exhibition, you walk through and there is a constant embedding of the German experience in a broader European and then even global history. So it talks about the broader European context. You see a map of Bukovina in Romania, Moldova, Ukraine nowadays, of this kind of concerted effort in the early 20th century to figure out the sort of precise ethnicities and racial groups, quote unquote, and to really think about how the 20th century put people into different groups and then gave rise rise to the various moments of violence in the 20th century. But it also goes specifically into what the Poles call recovered territories of Silesia, Pomerania, and elsewhere, and what happens to the expellees when they arrive in the GDR, for instance, opposed to in Chemnitz, but also in West Germany. There are parallel memories throughout. It makes reference to the partition of India and Pakistan, to former Yugoslavia, and elsewhere, and really tries to make the point that there is nothing exceptional, in a sense, about German expellees and expulsion. It talks a lot about the German right to asylum, or the right to asylum in Germany, rather. It thinks about the personal experiences of refugees as well. Trying desperately to sort of essentialize German victimhood as such, and really makes references to the more recent moments of expulsion and refugees from Syria and elsewhere in Germany. But there is a connection of sorts to the Holocaust, and then also to Israel-Palestine. It invites in a forum to write about one's feelings. So what is your greatest concern? The second picture in the Israel-Gaza conflict. Everyone says abuses in human rights, or not everyone. Most people say abuses, human rights abuses. We don't know what they mean by that. Human rights abuses towards Israelis, towards Palestinians, we don't know. But then there are these labels, and there's a free Gaza. There are lots of critical commentaries about Israel's role in the conflict. So there is a connection of sorts. But before Mark growls at me and says, "Please conclude," I will conclude with some tentative suggestions which have disappeared. Never mind. Never mind. I will draw. There's one more slide. You are not missing much in terms of content as such. But the question is, why the absence? So why is the expulsion, or the memory of the expulsion, absent? Well, one is a lack of knowledge, right? So schools, the public, migration patterns, all that have led to the, in a sense, disappearance of expulsion from public discourse in some way. The fear that the Holocaust would be forgotten, which is something that I think has been there, hasn't actually come about, but rather it's German expulsions that have all but sort of not disappeared, but at least become quite muted. The second is generational change. So the older kind of devotees to German victimhood, like Erika Steinbach, no longer determine that discourse. The third one is the context. I do think an opening a museum during COVID was a bad idea, because there were just fewer people to go there. But the fourth one, and I'll end with this, is indeed anti-Semitism as a motivation for post-colonial memory not making common cause with the memory of expulsions. I think there'll be so much opportunity to talk about the Nakba as something that happened in parallel with Germans, or with German expulsions. It would be a very interesting way to think about it, because to my mind, that kind of post-colonial activism and memory, and I'm generalizing here, of course, is in some ways stuck in a rut where perhaps German expulsion memory was in the 1980s, of seeing the Holocaust as a threat, as a belligerent, as a contester in some ways. And so I will simply end this presentation by referring back to Michael Stürmer in 1986, where he says we have to think about and work against those who control and determine the memory in Germany. And I think with that very stark quote, we see the kind of the underlying motivation behind the contestation against the Holocaust by post-colonial activists and memory activists in Germany today. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Moving to our third speaker, probably needs no introduction, but Bill Niven is the Professor Emeritus of Contemporary German History at Nottingham Trent University.
Thank you. Is this working fine? I was just thinking about, James, what you said there about Nakba and the expulsions. And I remember talking to someone in the course of the Moses debate about this and saying, well, couldn't you compare Nakba with the expulsions of the Germans? No, the Germans were expelled as a result of a genocidal war. There's nothing like that in Nakba. I thought, what about the attack of the Arabs? No. And we cannot compare these things. And that's one of the reasons, I think, is that they will not. It's a speculation. On November 2023, Omer Bartov and a number of other leading Holocaust scholars published an open letter in the New York Review of Books in which they took issue with the use of Nazism and Holocaust comparisons by political leaders in Israel and elsewhere in relation to the attack by Hamas. A little later, the word others creeps in, and when the signatories argue that these comparisons represent an intellectual and moral failing, they refer to the need for politicians to avoid stoking the flames when tensions are running high, but also for academics to uphold their duty towards the intellectual integrity of their profession and supporting others in attempting, I quote, to make sense of this moment. There are then two sets of addressees here, politicians and academics, and there are two concerns, ethical and historiographical. I think we can all agree that throwing historical comparisons around, usually in an aggressively formulated and apodictic way to support a war effort, is likely to inflame an already desperate situation. But this being so, the co-signatories should also have warned against the tendency of Hamas to compare Israel with Nazism, something that group has done since the beginning of the current war. As for academics, why is their intellectual professional integrity bound to avoiding comparisons between Hamas and Nazism? The signatories point to the danger of separating the current crisis from the context out of which it has arisen. I quote, 75 years of displacement, 56 years of occupation, 16 years of the Gaza blockade have generated an ever-deteriorating spiral of violence and can only be arrested by a political solution. We are also told that academics have a responsibility to use words and judgment with sensitivity. Surely we would all agree with that. But why do the signatories define context in a way which makes Israel solely to blame for the situation in Gaza? Is that using words and judgment with sensitivity? If academics can help to illuminate the present, contribute to peace in the Middle East, as the co-signatories hope, if, in other words, careful historical analysis can play its diplomatic part, why would such historical analysis not look at both sides of the argument? Isn't that what we're supposed to do as academics? Some of you will know that a debate was unleashed, and James just mentioned it, in 2021 by genocide historian A. Dirk Moses, I keep forgetting the A, when he criticized Germany's memory culture, among other things, because it was allegedly predicated on an obsession with Holocaust uniqueness, unquestioning loyalty to Israel, and an equation of anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. I contributed to the ensuing debate by arguing that we needed more balance in our analysis of the Middle East, because while everyone seemed very ready to condemn Israel, no one seemed to be taking time to point out the problem posed by Hamas. The late historian Alan Confino replied by saying that while it was always good advice to point to the importance of balance, and now I quote, being balanced or arguing for complexity should not be used as an argument to hide the violent reality of occupier and occupied. I reflected a lot on this. I was puzzled that on the one hand, Confino acknowledged that advocating balance was always good advice, only to go on to suggest that actually sometimes it isn't. Confino appeared to be arguing that because the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians was one of perpetrator and victim, respectively, then any attempt to, as it were, assess that relationship in terms which might assign degrees of responsibility over both groups would be a travesty. If I may add my own metaphor here, it would be like partly blaming the Jews for what the Nazis did to them. But Confino's dismissal of the notion of a balanced approach as somehow unethical in this case is based not on the results of an objective historical appraisal, nor are we dealing here with a self-evident historical truth, which any concept of balance would deny, but with the construction of the appearance of such a truth. But because Bartov and the Open Letters co-signatories, among them Alan Confino, believed all blame for the current situation lay with Israel, comparing Hamas to Nazism represented for them an inversion of the perceived perpetrator-victim binary. In line with this thinking, they naturally rejected any suggestion the events of 7 October could be understood as a genocidal act, and certainly not one comparable to the Holocaust. Indeed, they argued that there are no grounds for comparing the Nazi genocide with the Hamas attack, because that genocide involved a state and its willing helpers attacking a tiny minority. And they protested at the abuse of Holocaust memory to portray, I quote, Israel's collective punishment of Gaza as a battle for civilization in the face of barbarism. While academic critics of Israel acknowledge that the Hamas attack naturally evoked memories of the Holocaust, they are quick to object to the perceived instrumentalization of these memories and their deployment as anti-Palestinian propaganda. Or, like Mariana Hirsch, they suggest that the attack on Gaza represents some kind of pathological response to a real or imagined post-memorial traumatization. I won't get into that disingenuous article by Hirsch. And they insist on context, by which they usually mean that the imagined post-memorial, sorry, I got that, where am I? They insist on context, by which they usually mean the Hamas attack, while constituting unconscionable violence, in the words of the open letter, needs to be seen as a response to decades of Israeli oppression. A little later, the New York Review of Books published a response to that Bartov open letter, and it was signed by Jeffrey Herf and 31 other scholars, including myself. So there we are, as my positionality, who, by contrast, defended the exploration of comparisons and pointed to a long tradition of Arab anti-Semitism with links to Nazism, citing the Islamist Jew hatred that emerged in the 1930s with the Muslim Brotherhood, of which today's Hamas is an offshoot. Herf and his co-signatories also argue that Hamas has had a state in Gaza for 17 years and a civil society that, while terrorized by Hamas, has willing Hamas supporters. Now, the New York Review of Books were nice enough to publish that letter, but they didn't want to publish it without giving the signatories of the first open letter a chance to respond to that, which, of course, they did. And they reiterated there's no meaningful basis for a comparison between Nazism, Hamas, and the Holocaust. The Gaza Strip, they argued, has been under siege for 16 years. Asserting ideological affinities between Nazism and Hamas amounts, they continue to promoting a myth of Nazi-like Islamic anti-Semitism. Moreover, framing October 7th in terms of the Holocaust, I quote, evades the fundamental issues underlying the conflict and disavows the role of the State of Israel in shaping them. These issues are the Nakba, the displacement of Palestinian refugees, the lack of equal rights between the river and the sea, the occupation, the settlements, the siege, and the absence of any prospect of positive political change. As in their first open letter, the co-signatories, even while acknowledging the atrocity of 7 October, assumed the existence of a clear, indisputable, historical and contemporary perpetrator-victim binary, Israeli-Palestinian, in which Israel acts as perpetrator and Hamas reacts, a reaction which prompts further Israeli perpetration. Hamas's reaction, then, is a mirror image of Israeli violence. It is fundamentally unideological, not something which in any respect emerges from anti-Semitism. This is a common view currently and leads many to conceive of the 7th of October as resistance. The postulated categorization is upheld in open letters by Bartov and others by dismissing Arab anti-Semitism as a myth and the legitimacy of construing historical links between Hamas and anti-Semitism. In fact, it can only be maintained by such dismissals. And I was initially surprised by the alacrity with which academic letters roundly reject the analytic value of comparison, especially when one considers that several of these people have spent their academic careers vehemently arguing on behalf of the importance of comparison. A. Dirk Moses, for instance, has repeatedly insisted on the need to see the Holocaust in relation to histories of German colonialism. And while comparing is not equating, they love making that comment, Moses makes us aware that there are maybe some patterns and elements in colonial thinking and praxis which are echoed in National Socialist thinking and praxis, such that comparison may help to reveal continuity and difference. Michael Rothberg, in his seminal book, Multidirectional Memory, already mentioned today, has shown that memory of the Holocaust has never operated in a vacuum or necessarily been implicated in a zero-sum game where other memories are cancelled out, but inspired by memories of other atrocities and injustices, namely under colonialism. Besides, Omer Bartov has been quite happy to compare the German Wehrmacht with the IDF. Generally, commentators on the left critical of Israel have had no compunction about comparing Gaza to a Nazi ghetto. Thus, the journalist Masha Gessen did so in the New Yorker in December 2023. And while she acknowledged differences, for her the comparison still stood because both the Nazis and Israel had, as occupying authorities, chosen, I quote, to immiserate and mortally endanger an entire population. When she was criticized for this comparison, Rothberg predictably leapt to her defense. To put this simply, you can't have it both ways. Either it's acceptable to compare or it isn't. You can't declare certain areas as it were off limits for comparison because it doesn't suit you. By the way, not just to those who declare comparisons between Hamas and Nazism to be eo ipso out of bounds, but those who do the same when it comes to comparisons of Israel with Nazism. Now, speaking for myself, the latter comparisons cause me enormous headaches. I hate them, and I distrust the motives of those who make them. But the point is, I've no doubt Moses, Bartov, Rothberg, and others would react similarly to Hamas-Nazi comparisons. I know that. I would not attempt to invalidate the very legitimacy of either of these comparative approaches, and certainly not by means of a false premise. If I argue or imply that comparisons between Nazism and Israel are out of bounds because they invert an absolute victim-perpetrator binary, I am on just as shaky ground as those such as the Bartov letter signatories who argue or imply that Hamas-Nazism comparisons are out of bounds because they too violate a victim-perpetrator binary. There is no such thing as a clear-cut distinction in the current crisis in the Middle East, nor, and that's the false premise. There isn't the victim and the perpetrator. Such bold categorizations are effectively moralization designed to discredit any challenge to differentiated discussion in the bud. Time that I've got left. I'll carry on. If I run out of time. I'm almost there. It is striking how many on the left responded to 7th of October by immediately insisting on the need for context. You'll have heard this word context. It suddenly became a very important word. This was in some context. This was in, yes, please, I'll have two with sugar. This was in some ways certainly a response to exactly the Bartov and co-signatories objected to it and the context. We should not lose sight in trying to understand 7 October of Israel's decades-long persecution of Palestinians. I would return here to the ethical and epistemological distinction, or perhaps difficult relationship I mentioned at the beginning. The ethical questions alone, though, are tricky. One can agree that apodictic comparisons made by far-right or even just right-wing Israeli politicians between Hamas and Nazism are dangerous because they are indeed forms of weaponization designed to instill or foster existing antagonism towards Palestinians. The same goes for sharply politicizing appeals to Holocaust. This wasn't which, whether we call them a pogrom or not, triggered national memory of the most horrendous event in Jewish history. It's not inherently unethical to compare the Holocaust with 7 October or feel reminded of the Holocaust, or for that memory to feed into responses to the Hamas attack more generally. It is not obviously ethical to compare Gaza with the Warsaw Ghetto. Such a comparison can weaponize just as much as comparing Hamas to Nazism can. At the same time, that comparison can raise valid questions about Israel's context and intention. And the more of the context there is, the more we can move away from the politicizing use of comparison to its use to enhance understanding. The trouble is that the signatories of the two letters deploy what I call a strategy of decontextualized contextualization. One-sided contextualization in order to preserve intact that victim-perpetrator binary I referred to. Context operates strategically. The yes, but strategy, a kind of whataboutery or more perspective. And co-signatories, indeed, on the left, such as the ubiquitous Judith Butler, killings on the 7th of October, only to immediately point to the Israeli persecution of Palestinians. It's almost as if the eye cannot be allowed to rest for too long on the images of 7 October, the accounts of horror, the rapes, the murders, and mutilations. The textual optics swings away to itemize Israel's crimes. The shift insists the reader view the atrocities of Hamas through the lens on the suffering of Palestinians. This has the effect, on the one hand, of emphasizing that the horror of 7 October has been preceded by Israeli horror, a much longer horror, decades long, we often read, as if one day of Hamas horror in October is almost an irrelevant tiny drop in an ocean of Israeli injustice. Furthermore, it is implied that the 7th of October was the response to those decades of Israel infliction. An excessive one for sure, we make that concession, but one born of Israel's excess. Alongside the tactic of minimizing the 7th of October, we can observe an attempt to convince us that it was the day on which desperation at the decades of oppression finally exploded, a cumulative moment, a view not a million miles away from that peddled by some extreme anti-Israel voices, that the 7th of October was a liberating act of resistance. At any rate, Bartov, his co-signatories, Guess and Butler, they all seem incapable of assigning any real responsibility to Hamas for the 7th of October. And by real responsibility, I mean that Hamas's actions appear as reactions to them, mirror images of Israeli violence, such that personal agency, group agency, and autonomy are utterly played down. So I could stop there. How much time have I got? 30 seconds. Right, I'll just go to the inclusion. Inclusion. The first open letter by Bartov and co-signatories argues that academics have the responsibility to use words and expertise with judgment. And we would all agree with that. But they also have responsibility to uphold scientific methods, like of comparison as a generally scholarly principle. And since they've been insisting on, it's exactly what's happening. That politicians abuse comparisons for aggressive purposes does not mean that scholars should necessarily resist them. On the contrary, precisely by conducting comparison in a scholarly profession, can use it meaningfully as opposed to enhance understanding.
Our final speaker, Amy Williams, an independent scholar with emphases on the Kindertransport and Holocaust memory. So, Amy,
thank you. Okay. I think we're running slightly over time, so I'm going to not go through all my examples that I have. But yeah, for over the past year, Israelis and Jews, wrong way around. So for over the year, Israelis and Jews have been criticised about how they commemorate the horrific events of October 7th, the displacement of civilians from the north and the south of the country, the tragic suicides after October 7th, the soldiers who had died in battle, the police who have lost their lives while on duty, the ongoing war, and the continued loss of life in Israel and beyond its borders. The memorials themselves, their placement in certain spaces and the wider context that they and divisions within Israeli society. But this diverse remembering is overlooked by many critics, and some we've heard about, Klein, Hirsch, Rothberg. I lived in Israel for quite a long time. I worked at Yad Vashem, and I went to many of these memorials. I have hundreds and hundreds of photos, and I took part every week on a Friday and Saturday in these memorial events. And I am concerned that some critics have misrepresented Israeli memorialization. Their criticism, for me, is often unfair. I can't see that, so I'm going to read from my phone. My argument then is that the 7th October memorials do not manipulate Holocaust memory or re-traumatize Israelis to make them aggressive towards Palestinians. Holocaust memory and memorials to October 7th inspire empathy, healing, and solidarity across generations. The multidirectionality of seeing the Holocaust in relation to October 7th is natural. Never again is an obligation to bring the hostages home. There is street art and memory and memorial activism, and then there is attacking and vandalizing memorials. Holocaust memorials are being weaponized and the historical record is being misrepresented. It is memorials to the suffering in Gaza which often show aggression, and sometimes this is done in the form of violating the 7th of October memorials, Holocaust memorials, and other war memorials. The 7th of October memorials they present an avenging story. They reduce empathy. They even rationalize killing. They are an expansion of the war. None of them commemorate the suffering in Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, and Iran. They suggest that they are aggressively fused with Holocaust memory. They abuse the language and phrases which are now synonymous with the Holocaust. They even moralize how Israelis should mourn, and multidirectional memory can be applied to the approved examples. I argue that they have no acknowledgement of multidirectional memory in Israel. They never talk about North African experiences of the Holocaust. They don't really talk about Shlomo Mansour, for example, who survived the Farhud. Memory can produce solidarity, but the ongoing attacks on Holocaust memorials, which they never mention, are about denying the historical victimhood of Jews by overwriting it with that of Palestinians. The repeated attacks on Holocaust memorials dedicated to resistance suggest that Jews should not be protected past and present. Several memorials have also had Jews are perpetrators perpetrators painted on them, which inverts history. The red hands on the Holocaust Memorial in Paris go further in evoking violence against Jews that we think of scenes in Ramallah, effectively celebrating the deaths of those the memorial lists or remember as victims and calling for further killings. The attacks on Holocaust memorials are about removing Jewish stories and reframing history. Thus, the present is used to offset the past. So I came up with my own categories of what memorials do. We have memorials which preserve memory of the event, and those that tackle anti-Semitism. We have memorials which address world responses, those which specifically remember gender-based violence, those which are about Israeli resilience, those which mourn Israeli suffering, those which express general solidarity towards hostages, those which are critical of the Israeli government, those which appeal for the hostages' return, ceasefire, and the end of war, those which remember specific individuals as well as a larger collective. And many of these memorials, as we'll see in a minute, perform multiple functions, and they grapple with the tensions between them. The critics, on the other hand, argue that they either incite unlimited violence and revenge, manipulate Holocaust memory, ignore the suffering of others, celebrate and justify the Israeli government's campaign, deny subsequent events, demonize Palestinians as modern-day Nazis, or traumatize Israelis as if they are constantly re-experiencing the 7th of October, or ignore the assumed fact that Israel is a colonial state continuing its present-day expansion plans. So, the yellow ribbon existed well before October 7th. It was placed in Israel as early as 2008. What is really interesting about these memorials is that they often were used, these first memorials, to gather evidence, to document, essentially. And that is what I'm going to leave my phone. And that is what I found most interesting. Klein, for example, she's very critical about how quick these memorials sprang up. She claims that decades for the Holocaust to be commemorated, but this isn't true. Well, entirely true. The Holocaust survivors of Buchenwald, for instance, erected memorials in the days after liberation. There was also civilian tours of the camps to show people evidence of the Nazis' crimes against humanity. A lot of these memorials, particularly those in Hostage Square, are outside the Tel Aviv Art Museum, a museum that sort of projects itself onto the square. It's about collecting, preservation, interpretation, and displaying objects of cultural significance. Exile, diaspora, Jewish experiences, Christian experiences, Muslim histories, and of course the Holocaust. This is essentially projected onto the streets. This urgent need to document the lives of those related to the Holocaust, but also October 7th, was incredibly put forward at the Palmach Museum when I went recently. The initial memorials to October 7th were really to remember little known stories of people that we didn't really know much about at that point. In the museum, there is a room to remember the fallen who fought for the Israeli independence. One of the dead is a Holocaust survivor, yet little is known about his life. It is assumed that he was the only living person from his family who survived the Holocaust. He died in 1948. The only few sentences in his folder state where he died. Some individuals who have lost relatives and friends on or since October 7th have actually written letters to this Holocaust survivor expressing their own pain. The relationship to Holocaust memory here is not about re-traumatization, but about safeguarding a loved one who has been killed. One letter, for instance, asks the Holocaust survivor who is deceased to take care of their loved one in the afterlife. Writing to the deceased Holocaust survivor is about Israelis it's not about being obsessed with this history or repeating itself. Rather, it's about victims of war finding comfort with other victims who know exactly what they're going through and who have experienced this loss. And then there was also a really interesting exhibition, called Surviving Moments. And this was from one of the ladies at the kibbutz who was just found out not long ago that her husband was murdered during captivity. And she did an exhibition on her photography that was really brought back because other people had her photos. Her photos had been burnt. Her archive had been lost during the attack on one of the kibbutz. It was near Oz kibbutz, and this presented a complex history of interactions between the kibbutz and Gaza. But within this photo exhibition, there were so many losses, and it wasn't about re-traumatization or saying, look, we should go out and murder Palestinians. Rather, the exhibition was responding to the destruction of October 7th, of the documentation of earlier histories as well. So, as I said, her exhibition was also about the life that she lived before October 7th. So it was about remembering a previous life and trying to piece that together. But it also doubled as a double family loss, essentially, because in her archive was her artwork about her family's history during the Holocaust. And this was not about, again, re-traumatization. It wasn't a traumatic response to the Holocaust, but a way of making loss visible, which only happens when individuals share what has been lost in their own histories. So that exhibition was incredibly moving. Okay, there are some upsetting images to come, so I'll just put that out there. This is images from Hostage Square. This question that is posed in the Bebas Boys poster, is he less human? This is not for an Israeli audience. This is for an international one. This is a memorial which stands against racial anti-Semitism. It tries to combat the narratives of the narrative that Jews are evil, subhuman, and solely to blame for the war. The little boys are presented in cages. It could be a criticism of Hamas's treatment of the child, obviously, but it could also reflect upon how Jews have lived and died in totalitarian cages before the international community did little to help them. And it also is a critique on the Red Cross as well. I'm going to go through these quite quickly just because of time. There are memorials, particularly gender-based memorials, and these are to the female hostages. These memorials stand up against the fact that rape is not a form of resistance. It challenges some of the responses around the world. There is this, the bigger picture it's called Start Watching installation. It was sort of there as a IDF unit for women to locate and bring their fellow female hostages home. Near the Hashalom train station that I got every day on the way to Yad Vashem from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, outside of school, there was these banners that said UN Women Silence, UN Women Unforgivable, UN Women Unbelievable, and so on. And then there was a performance at Hostage Square, a visual display called Dress Like Nama. This was not about traumatizing or traumatized Israelis coming together, but about remembering the hostages and why Israel is at war, as well as criticizing the tendency to think that the war's objectives have been achieved now that Hamas leadership has been dismantled, while the one main necessity is to bring the hostages home. This is not a memory inciting to attack, but one that is not forgetting the hostages who have been neglected, and about neglecting their return. Okay. So there are other ones of solidarity and hope, as you can see with the Hatikva. There is the Sukkah Memorial that you can see, which is about the fragility and transience of life. It's the tension between living and dead, between those who made it to safety, between vulnerability and dependence, and between humanity and impotence as well. The memorials that are the pension memorials, these are chairs that are literally chained together, and eyes out the main military base across the road. There are other demonstrations over there as well. There's the running out of time memorial. These are critical memorials, red hands. I mean, there's fires every week as well. So there's a critical, there are coffins as well. just to go back, that's called the Bridge of Abandonment. You also have these memorials about Stop the War and nooses around the neck. This was a critique of the soldiers that had died. Outside the Knesset, there's always somebody protesting. These memorials, you could argue that they are Lovelock memorials. They're not. They're looking memorials. They look across the road and they critique. They watch and watch and watch in terms of what the Israeli government is doing. There's a countdown clock as well, which shows again how long this has been going on. There are all these signs saying F this and F that as well. There's the Tunnel Memorial, which is critical of the Red Cross. Klein argues that if you go down this memorial, you'll be traumatized and come out and want to do whatever. But you don't. Like these, the memorial, yes, it's tragic and you feel a sense of confinement and you think, gosh, what awful conditions the hostages are living in. But the memorials, people have been told to leave messages of hope, and they fulfill, they surround the memorial. This memorial is a really interesting memorial, and I don't really have time to go into it just because we're running over. But you could argue this memorial, this is a missile that was turned into a Hanukkah. I mean, this could be a revenge memorial, but it's not. It's turned into something hope and solidarity. There are occasional memorials. There are lots of other memorials. The memorials to Yad Vashem, we could argue that there are 2,500 Holocaust survivors that were directly impacted by October 7th, and over 80 of them have already passed away since that date. There are memorials to solidarity and the dismantling ceremonies that we see when hostages come home. This memorial in the bottom, you could argue, is a memorial which is healing. It shows all languages remembering together, Hebrew, Arabic and English. Then you have these memorials, which I don't really have time to go into, but these are commemorating the suffering in Gaza. But they talk about revolution, and they use words that are rather aggressive. As you can see, there are lots of attacks on Holocaust memorials. There's also this memorial that they painted a rock to the Bibas family straight after it said Free Palestine. And then just after, there are lots of attacks on Holocaust memorials, which I don't have time to go into, but just to sort of sum up then. A lot of these memorials are intentionist memorials. They want you to do something, and they want you to either remember the hostages or remember children killed in Gaza. They both have that in common, but what they don't have in common is the way in which they do that and use that message. The attacks on Holocaust memorials have minimized, misrepresented, they've distorted Holocaust memory as well. Like they've called for Kindertransports. The Kindertransport to Britain particularly didn't happen during a war. So I'll leave it there. We were running over, but thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your talk. So I have two very quick questions. One is for you, James, and maybe also for others. So in Germany, for example, we've seen banners on demonstrations, on pro-Palestine demonstrations, which said Dresden 45 and Gaza 23, and they showed the pictures. So there have been some comparisons made, but I'm not sure if it's how you would see that and where this comes from, and if you think there's already if this is going to happen more. And the other thing is, Amy, thank you very much for, I think, stating what should at least be very obvious, that of course Holocaust memory and October 7th memory and grief is first and foremost, does not, I think, trigger more violence, but is first and foremost a way to reflect and repair, right? But then, and this is maybe for everyone also, the Moses and others are trying to say, basically, I think that by trying to say that Holocaust memory is the trigger factor of violence itself. So they're kind of trying to put this kind of in a discourse analysis in the center of their discourse analysis, and are obsessed only with discourse, and in this way are trying to say it's the memory, right? So, and I think that's a very big part, and I don't know what you think about that. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Lady here.
Hi, thank you so much for your fascinating panel. I have a very broad question, actually, which is not addressed to any one of you in particular. I'm from Italy, and I've been in the area of Holocaust education for a number of years, and I've been in contact with many Holocaust educators who are very qualified people. They have been teaching about the Holocaust for 20, 30 years, some of them. And what has been happening since October the 7th is that many of them are saying, I don't feel comfortable to teach about the Holocaust because of what's going on in Gaza and in the Middle East. So my initial reaction was a shocking reaction, because what's it about between anti-Semitism or the Holocaust and what's going on in the Middle East? But I'm afraid that this is affecting many Holocaust educators also in other countries. So I'd like to hear from you if there is any kind of rational or logical explanation about what this is happening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any more at the moment? We take the gentleman at the back, and then we'll take those three.
Thank you very much for a fascinating panel. Bill, this is for everyone, but Bill, you flipped over it really quickly, and I understand why. Pathology. So much of what's been asked, I think, and in the background is somehow Jews are pathologized because of the Holocaust. The Holocaust has entered into, fascinatingly, anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist world outlooks. It's been incorporated, and any memory of the Holocaust, there's a ressentiment which turns itself into a pathology, so that when Jews mention the Holocaust now, it's either, as the last speaker said, weaponization, or it's a trauma that's leading to other harm, and they're stuck in it. The whole world has got over it. You Jews are pathologized, and until you lay it to rest, you're going to attack, and so on and so forth. That's more of a comment than a question. Sorry.
There's a question in there, definitely. We'll go in the reverse order. So, maybe first.
Just a few things, obviously, that connect to the first question, but also I didn't get to say in my talk. It's interesting when we talk about Holocaust, the weaponization of Holocaust memory, because the Holocaust, October 7th, they have a biographical connection. You know, Holocaust survivors were tragically murdered and taken captive, but also their families were impacted as well. These are interconnected through, you know, family bonds, generational loss, grief, suffering. And as I said, 2,500 Holocaust survivors were directly impacted, and several are still being displaced. One of the kinder that I know, their wife was a hostage. Thank God she's freed. There were all these interconnections. And I know Klein, for example, had questioned, you know, why are we interviewing Holocaust survivors about October 7th? Well, why not? Like, this is part of their life story. If we think about interviewing as this longitudinal approach, you know, we have to include it. But then just a final comment, just to say that Klein had an issue with some of the survivors of October 7th having the tattoo of the date, and she compared this to the tattoos in Auschwitz, which I do not see a comparison at all. People get their birth dates tattooed all the time. I know one of my friends, tragically, their body is still in Gaza. They got a tattoo of a date that was on a photograph, and it was not inspired by Holocaust tattoos. It was inspired by totally other means. So that I feel like they are the ones that are constantly obsessed with using Holocaust memory in this debate, where it doesn't have a seat at the table all the time. It's not always connected to the Holocaust. But then also, on the other hand, when you talk to survivors of October 7th and their families and the survivors, of course they're going to think about the Holocaust. Why wouldn't you? It's part of your life story. It's part of your family story. It's one tragedy. Sadly, with many tragedies in one family now, people have a right to think about them and connect.
Yep.
Like that.
Go.
The mic.
Yeah, I use the word pathology, I think, in relation to what I've been saying about that she'd written about post memory, and was kind of suggesting that when she'd been teaching about post-memory in Israel and perhaps also in American campuses, maybe some people had misunderstood and they'd started to kind of imagine themselves into a state of being post-traumatized. And then from this had resulted the aggression that you saw in Israel's response. And so she was kind of pathologizing her own theory and sort of taking on almost kind of, oh, maybe it was my fault. This is what I find so disingenuous sometimes about this, is it didn't seem to be very, very sincere at all. But yeah, you're right. I mean, a lot of so that particular view of trauma, and we had a talk about trauma earlier on being pathologized. Israel's response to what's happening in Gaza, to the Hamas attack, is regarded as a pathological response resulting from, for instance, the Holocaust trauma or an imagined post-memorial trauma, an overreaction, something that happened because of the experience of Nazism, or something perhaps that's also rooted in Zionism as an inherently aggressive force. Not a force for construction at all, but essentially destructive, essentially racist, which of course is also pathological. So you will find this all the way through. And I think that's a very good point that you raised. It is actually a trope that is typical rather than specific to that example that I mentioned.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks to all the comments. Hendrik, just your question. I still don't see that development really, partly because my main contention is that the dominance of the expulsion as a memory trope in Germany hasn't really connected with post-colonial activism, and I think that the only, or not the only, but one of the explanations I have is that post-colonial memory and activism is stuck in this belligerent way of saying, give us space, you're taking our space. It's still in that cycle. So where it connects to German victims like Dresden in 1945, yeah, it's an accusation. You know, the poor Germans in Dresden were bombed in the same way that, you know, the IDF is acting in Gaza. So I think that drawing on the memory of the expulsion would have so much potential actually finding common ground for saying, you know, for the 100,000 Germans of Palestinian descent or the 800,000 Syrians now living in Germany, of saying, actually, we share sort of common past and we don't have to obsess about the position of the Holocaust. But it's not happening at the moment, so we'll watch this space. And just one quick comment to your question about. I mean, I know Jamie's the better person to answer this. Just an anecdote from a nice afternoon in Berlin last April. Bill, do you remember, with Stefan Klevers, author of Decolonizing Auschwitz? We were having coffee with him, and then he said to me that he spent 10 years in Holocaust education and outreach, taking multi-faith, multicultural school groups to various sites in Germany. And he's sort of sitting there, you know, it's sort of rather sort of depressing manner, which is very endearing, saying, and it was all nothing. So I think there is a kind of shared experience of a kind of where Holocaust education sits at the moment. But Jamie is the expert.
I know, James. Before James. The Leibniz was remembered during the Syria, when all the Syrians were coming to Germany, 2015. It was definitely there on placards. I remember that some of the church, the Evangelical churches, there were a few of these, and there were people in Munich in tears. I remember, and saying on ZDF things like, I remember my mother coming or my grandmother coming, and so it triggered that very visceral memory on a personal level as well. But now it's just vanished, and I agree with you. It seems to have vanished since then. Sorry.
So I'm going to pick up the Holocaust education point because I'm a Holocaust educator. I think it's been really interesting going into schools since 7th of October. And I've had to think a lot about how I do things. There's one session I teach on pre-war Jewish life, which I think is really powerful. And this autumn, I spent a week and I went to 2 schools, both with very, very high proportion of Muslim kids, primary school kids. And I really reflected on the importance of remembering that there is an explicit and an implicit or hidden curriculum. So we talk a lot about the diversity of Jewish life, and I explicitly link that to the diversity of Muslim life. Being a Muslim in Saudi Arabia, Muslim in somewhere else. And that's actually a very powerful way to humanize Jewish experience. The idea that national contexts make a difference. I've also back we need to create spaces of trust. So saying to kids, I'm going to make a deal with you. You can ask me whatever you like. The deal is you have to listen to the answer. And experience predicting misunderstandings that came from home. But also just the importance of remembering that kindness and curiosity should underpin our work as educators. And so by asking them like to see Ali. And the session ends very with me saying, and I think we have to remember that we are not in that place. And actually, the job of all of us who are not in that place is to use kindness and curiosity and what we know to make a space for peace of all.